Good afternoon. Steve, I also wanted to say congratulations. It's been an honor working with you on the board for the last 3 years, so excellent. Colas Canada is pleased today to sponsor P3 2022's Luncheon Keynote Address. Why Canada's infrastructure needs private financing now more than ever, by Laith Qamheiah, Managing Director, BMO Capital Markets. Colas Canada is a Canadian leader in construction and maintenance of transportation infrastructure with operations across Canada. We are part of the Colas group of companies, a world leader in transportation infrastructure, construction, and maintenance. Our group's core business is in road construction and maintenance, material manufacturing, and rail transit. When it comes to P3s in Canada, Colas has played a significant role on various projects, including the Fredericton to Moncton Highway in New Brunswick, the Sea to Sky Highway and Golden Ears Bridge in British Columbia, the A25 Bridge in Montreal, at Calwood Airport, and more recently the 427 Highway expansion right here in the GTA. Of great importance to those of us at the Council and in the P3 industry in Canada is the use of private finance when it comes to these major projects. After 3 decades of helping deliver successful projects in Canada, why are governments increasingly reluctant to make use of private finance to help shovels in the ground and make their infrastructure projects a reality? Especially when not involving banks and pension funds, removes additional and impartial oversight and rigor from government procurement, construction, operations and maintenance phases, leaving taxpayers exposed to potential cost overruns. In his keynote, Laith will explore how the market is innovating and adapting deal structures to ensure projects are a success for Canadians that meet the ambitions, goals, commitments of government. Laith has more than 17 years of investment banking experience with a focus on public-private partnership, advisory, and infrastructure financing. He has extensive experience in advising private sector clients, bidding on new infrastructure projects, as well as public sector clients on their procurement of infrastructure. Notable experiences include advising Infrastructure Ontario on 8 long-term projects, including the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, the Windsor-Essex Parkway, and currently advising Port of Montreal on the new Contrecoeur terminal. Please help me welcome Laith to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm greatly honored to be here today speaking before the leading players and decision makers within Canada's P3 and broader infrastructure industry. As such, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Robert and to Colas for inviting me to share my thoughts on the role that private capital should play in financing and deliver Canadian infrastructure. As Robert mentioned in his kind introduction, my name is Laith Qamheiah, and I'm a managing director at BMO Capital Markets, where I head up the Infrastructure Capital Markets Group. Our mandate involves providing financing advisory and debt placement services to public and private clients in the infrastructure space. I've been involved in advising on and financing P3 projects in Canada for close to 18 years. And as you might guess, I'm a strong proponent of using more long-term private capital to finance infrastructure projects. I do realize that as a banker, this may seem somewhat self-serving, then maybe it is a little. But as a taxpayer and user of infrastructure, I am concerned that the current approach by government to its infrastructure procurements is not making full and efficient use of what private capital can provide, to the detriment of our ability as a nation to deliver the new and renewed infrastructure needed to support our quality of life. While there have certainly been some efforts to better harness private funds to finance new infrastructure, including the establishment of the Canada Infrastructure Bank to crowd in private capital for projects that may otherwise struggle to attract such financing, the general trend has been for governments to implement procurement programs that crowd out private capital from participation in projects that would otherwise be very attractive to investors and which could benefit from the innovation, discipline, efficiency, and long-term value enhancement that private capital brings. Specific to P3s, I believe too many projects are being procured as BF or DBFs when they would greatly benefit from having long-term investment and operations and maintenance in their scope. And long-term projects, mainly in the name of keeping financing costs down, have large government capital contributions throughout the construction period to reduce the long-term private capital required, often due to an extremely narrow lens through which private capital is seen. Over the past few years, there have simply been too few projects coming to market that present attractive opportunities in which debt and equity investors are able to participate. Today, I'd like to address some of the common arguments put forward against the use of more private capital in P3s, how limiting private capital creates challenges for financing P3 projects, and most importantly, how private capital, brought to bear through the P3 model, benefits overall procurement of infrastructure. Private capital has always played and will continue to play a vital role in financing Canadian infrastructure. Depending on your definition of P3s, there are close to 300 active P3 projects across the country, involving approximately 70 billion of private capital. Under Ontario's P3 program alone, more than 30 billion of private debt and equity have funded nearly 100 projects in healthcare, justice, transit, transportation, and a host of other asset classes. Beyond P3s, private capital funds airports, railways, power plants, electric and gas utilities, and other essential infrastructure. There are significant pools of capital dedicated to investing in infrastructure assets, both for primary and secondary opportunities, and more such capital continues to be raised every day. These funds are searching for attractive investment opportunities where they can share their considerable financial firepower, industry expertise and know-how, and willingness and ability to manage project risks for the overall benefit of the Canadian public. Yet there continues to be debate on whether private capital helps or hinders infrastructure procurement, and whether it comes at too steep a cost to justify its use. I'm here today to make the case that long-term private capital is an essential component of the financing options available to fund public infrastructure, and that governments should and will need to make more use of it if they are ever to meet their infrastructure objectives, even if from their vantage point, private capital appears to carry a premium. As I'd mentioned earlier, over the past number of years, we've seen government authorities limit the involvement of long-term private capital in P3 projects through the use of procurement models such as wide equity that completely eliminates debt, and build finance or design-build finance that limits borrowing to short-term construction loans. And even in the case where DBFM or DBFOM models are used, large public contributions are made to reduce the amount of private capital needed over the life of the project. As far as I can tell, there are main two arguments used to justify this approach. First, to reduce overall project costs since private capital is considered to be more expensive than public funds. And second, to give public authorities more flexibility to amend the operational scope of infrastructure assets without needing long-term lender consent. This flexibility is especially important in the context of transit projects, which, while procured as standalone, are often components of a larger system that requires optimization over time. So let's start with flexibility. Governments have decided that transit projects are more suited to the DBF or collaborative models to allow for future flexibility to implement significant variations at the discretion of government. But before any significant variation, however defined, can be implemented, lenders require that their prior approval be sought. In practice, it is difficult to get debt holders to approve significant changes for various reasons, including disagreement over what structural amendments are needed to preserve the credit quality of the project. But instead of excluding long-term capital altogether, what if there were provisions in the project agreement setting out a change mechanism that wouldn't require a government and borrower to seek lender approval so long as certain conditions were met that are meant to ensure the project's credit strength is maintained? Such conditions would mirror provisions commonly seen in lending documents that serve to restrict the borrower from causing the credit to deteriorate through, for example, taking on more debt. And these could include tests such as rating confirmations and the maintenance of minimum credit metrics. Lenders in our market have proven themselves able to adapt to various novel project agreement provisions, so long as they're reasonable. And I believe lenders would be open to such an approach. The cost argument is more complicated to deal with because it's ultimately a matter of how one assesses value. And while costs, like interest expense, seem easy to quantify, assessing value is a more difficult exercise. This problem, in my opinion, is made worse by the singular focus on risk transfer, While risk transfer is absolutely a vital component of the P3 model, focusing on the value of transferred risk as the main benefit of P3s and of private capital ignores other intangible benefits, such as added due diligence and sharing of expertise, which I'll discuss in more detail later on. Focusing mainly on risk transfer also doesn't necessarily promote a cooperative approach to a long-term partnership, but rather forces parties to be more adversarial in negotiating how to allocate risk and how to deal with future problems when they arise. In their attempt to maximize risk transfer, public authorities are overlooking that P3s are intended to allocate risks to the parties most suited to managing them. And in this manner, they end up weakening the very organizations they depend on to help deliver the infrastructure promised to the public. As a result, we now see a pendulum shift of risk and cost back to the public sector. It is true that private capital is more expensive than public money, but private capital has been finding ways to reduce financing costs for P3 projects considerably over time. As equity is the most expensive capital, P3 projects have successfully reduced the proportion of equity in the capital structure to less than 10%, resulting in real and meaningful cost savings. And if we ignore current market conditions, risk premiums, whether for equity or for debt, have been decreasing over time as investors become more comfortable with the asset class. It's also worth noting that the initial set of P3 projects, while still concerned with financing costs, didn't try to reduce those costs by shrinking private capital. Early projects generally did not use construction period payments or substantial completion payments, and DBFs were used to renovate existing facilities where it was thought that long-term capital would be challenged to manage risk on legacy infrastructure. Unfortunately, the idea of using construction payments to reduce financing costs has become a permanent feature of projects across Canada. And in extreme cases, we've seen up to 85% of project costs being paid out by public authorities before construction is completed. But there are real drawbacks to reducing long-term private capital in a P3 project, the most notable of which is the hollowing out of the capacity to bring smart, innovative, future-focused solutions to the delivery of public facilities and services. From a practical standpoint, large construction payments often lead to an inefficient capital structure. As the size of the financing relative to the size of a project is shrunk, capital is at more risk of loss for any given event, limiting the ability of such capital to take on project risks. In order to deal with this effect, rating agencies and lenders often require enhancements to meet minimum resiliency requirements. These could include additional equity and bigger security packages, all features that add cost to the overall project. Public capital contributions during construction can also present challenges to a project's credit quality. Public capital is given priority over debt during a termination, as any compensation payment is reduced by the amount of public funding already paid. Rating agencies and lenders have to consider how public contributions will affect their ability to recover in a default, and whether that limits the overall quality of a project. In addition, because these payments tend to be bridged using bank loans, consideration is given to the quality of the banking group used, which could also limit the overall quality of the project. It is challenging to put together large bank syndicates, especially for the transit DBFs, where significant loan facilities are needed to finance construction. Bank market capacity is not unlimited, and I anticipate this particular challenge to be more pronounced in the coming year as monetary policy squeezes bank market capacity further, limiting potential lender appetite to provide large loan commitments. There's also the issue of keeping private capital interested and engaged in supporting P3s. DBF projects give little opportunity for private capital to participate, as they typically have no equity and all of the lending is short-term. And DBFM deals where large capital contributions have small equity requirements that don't appeal to larger equity investors such as pension funds. They also result in small debt requirements that limit the appeal to capital market investors. In the long term, such a dynamic is going to lessen the desire by equity and debt providers to invest in understanding P3s and in dedicating resources to the sector, as attractive investment opportunities are limited, eventually resulting in less availability of capital and perhaps even flight to other more attractive markets. At one point, Canada's P3 industry was a world leader, owing to the pace of attractive projects coming to market every year. attracting global design, construction, operations, and investment firms. The industry created precedents and templates for how to deliver infrastructure projects quickly and efficiently. It would be quite a loss to Canada if this experience and expertise were allowed to wither and disappear due to lack of investment opportunities. Now let's shift focus to the benefits of using long-term capital in P3 procurement. As I mentioned before, trying to assess the additional value that private capital brings to any project is difficult to do. Value for money analysis tries to quantify this upfront, but it's highly dependent on assumptions around risk transfer for any particular project. I think the benefits are more apparent in hindsight and on a portfolio-wide basis, where it's more practical to assess such things as the pace of new project procurement with private capital, whether in the aggregate the program is subject to more or fewer cost overruns or schedule delays, and whether in the long term service quality and upkeep of facilities is better or worse relative to other traditional procurement. Ultimately, when all the benefits and not just risk transfer are considered, I believe private capital adds value to P3 projects that more than offset the added costs. So what are some of these benefits besides risk transfer? In a time where government spending is under scrutiny and budgets are being increasingly squeezed, and at the same time infrastructure needs continue to grow, it's difficult to see how public authorities will be able to meet their objectives for new build and renewal using only government funds. The pools of private capital available to invest in infrastructure can supplement government resources to allow for the procurement of a larger number of projects. Otherwise, the alternative is to slow down programs to fit within constraints of available public funding in any given period. I suspect we'll see this play out in our efforts to invest in energy transition projects. It's inconceivable that we'll be able to tackle this monumental task without massive involvement of private capital, a parallel to the P3 industry, illustrating how important a role private capital plays in infrastructure procurement. There's also the additional due diligence that long-term capital brings to a project. Equity and debt investors will carry out a thorough risk assessment of a project before committing to invest, and once investment is made, will put in place controls to ensure that risk profile doesn't deteriorate. Public authorities can benefit from this scrutiny, as private capital serves to validate the authority's plans for the infrastructure, provides feedback on how to improve such plans, and ultimately oversees implementation as required. One of the more beneficial features of long-term P3s is the upfront planning and provision for lifecycle requirements over the full term of a P3 concession. With both parties committing to a lifecycle regime at the outset, new infrastructure is designed and constructed with long-term performance in mind, and with adequate funding earmarked to ensure proper maintenance and upkeep. Under traditional procurement, it's all too easy for government authorities to redirect lifecycle investment away from existing infrastructure and towards other priorities, eventually resulting in ill-maintained facilities and substandard service quality over time. It is somewhat understandable given the budgetary pressures with which governments have to deal. Having long-term private capital partners is the only realistic way for public authorities to get a long-term warranty over newly built infrastructure, something that's not feasible under traditional procurement. Lastly, and I think this is the fundamental point of the P3 model, including long-term private capital means that public authorities have long-term partners who will share responsibility for ensuring public facilities perform as intended. For this to work well, however, both parties have to approach their partnership from the outset in good faith and with a cooperative mindset. Unfortunately, there are too many instances where parties take a more transactional approach to P3s, which can make the relationship more adversarial than cooperative. When service delivery does not meet required standards, it is well within the rights of the public authority to expect the private partner to provide and implement the needed solutions. But in my opinion, it's more useful for public authorities to work with their private sector partners to find viable solutions to problems that satisfy both parties, rather than sticking rigidly to the provisions of the project agreement and taking a hardline stance against their partners. As to the private sector, I believe it's ultimately more profitable and fruitful in such circumstances to be honest and transparent about performance issues rather than be defensive and look for ways to minimize their responsibility. Ultimately, no partnership is going to work well 100% of the time, as there will always be occasional issues and disputes. But if both parties are committed to making the partnership work, then there is much more chance of public authorities getting the infrastructure and service levels they desire, and more chance for the private sector to achieve their target returns. So how should government think of private capital? Ultimately, government should view private capital as a useful tool to help them meet their ambitious infrastructure goals. It's not a magic solution to all of their challenges in procuring infrastructure, and in some cases, it may not be the correct tool to use. But imposing a general limitation on the use of private capital serves only to hamper the ability of government to meet its objectives and unnecessarily sidelines potential partners that have valuable expertise and experience and the desire to invest in Canada's infrastructure and future. In closing, I urge various Canadian public authorities to reassess their approach to using long-term private capital in their procurements and to take full advantage of the significant pools of capital and thereby the experience and innovation and expertise looking to invest in our infrastructure by putting more projects into the market, by limiting the use of the DB and DBF models, and by reducing government contributions into DBFMs to more balanced levels. Thank you all for your time and attention today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.